Every time we want to use a lecture style method to teach our student, very often we will use presentation slides to provide a visual to help the students to understand better. But I realized that if I'm not careful in how I design my slides, the slides can cause more confusion or more distraction to the students. Sometimes the students look at the slides, they will lose focus very fast. So in this video, I will share with you two different ways to design the slides. The first way is how I would design the slides many years ago, which I felt was not very engaging. And the second way is how I would design the slides now, which I feel is a lot more engaging. Let's start by talking about the first way of designing the slides. Imagine I'm giving a lecture on growth mindset. So the first thing I want to talk about is the definition of the word mindset. And how I do this is I just copy the whole definition from the internet, from the dictionary, and paste it in the slides. And there's a few potential problems in these slides. First, some of the students may be wondering the word now under the title. They may be confused. Why is it mindset is a noun? Then some of the students might be confused by the definition because the words I use in the definition are not so simple to understand for some of the students. And when the students find it difficult to understand the definition, they may quickly look at the picture because looking at the picture might help them to understand better. But when you look at the picture, there are just too many words in the picture. When you look at so many words, you can be overwhelmed by it very quickly. So when the students are confused, it's very difficult to engage them later on. Then in the next slides, I try to put both mindsets side by side because I want to give the students a comparison. And I try to give the students a lot of information. Hopefully they can have a fuller picture of what the two mindsets are. But when the students look at slides like this, they'll be overwhelmed by just too many words in the slides. It's very difficult to stay focused when there are just too many words. First, they need to read the words in every sentence to try to understand what the sentence means. And at the same time, they also need to listen to what I say. And it can be very distracting. When the students are distracted, they will lose focus very fast. Then in these slides, same thing, I put both mindsets side by side. And I also give the students many examples because I thought by giving them a lot of examples, it can help them to understand better. But same thing, there are just too many words and too overwhelming and distracting to the students. And I realized that every time I design my slides like this, I will notice a lot of my students will be disengaged from the lecture. So we must always ask ourselves, what's the whole intention of using a presentation slides? It is to give the student a form of visual, to help them to understand something complex, something difficult to understand in a very simple way. And the key word here is simple. If simple is so important, then the content in our slide must also be as simple as possible. So right now, if I were to design my slides, I will try my best to look at the slides and simplify them. For example, I will ask myself, can I reduce the number of sentences in the slides? Can I reduce the number of bullets? When I look at the sentences, can I reduce the number of words in the sentences? And when I look at the pictures, can I make the pictures simpler? One look, you can understand what the teacher is saying. One look, it triggers you to make you curious, to make you reflect about your experience. Because when the students are curious, it is a lot easier to engage them later on. So let's go back to the lecture on growth mindset. Remember that the first thing that I want to talk about is the definition of mindset. Instead of just showing the student the whole definition of mindset, I will just show the student the title, and I try to make the title as short as possible, where it's just 3 words, where everyone in the class can understand what I'm going to say. It makes them curious to want to know what I want to say later on. And this is when I will tell the students, there are 2 very important components in every mindset. The first is your belief, and the second one is your actions. And then I will go back to belief and elaborate further. How I will elaborate is I will try to use a very simple to understand example, something that is relatable to every student in the class. For example, I will say things like, what is your belief? Do you believe that punctuality is very important? Do you believe that every time you meet your friend, you need to be there on time or early because you don't want your friends to wait for you? Something like this, something that everyone can relate to. Then maybe I'll give the students some time to think about it or talk to their friends. Then I'll move on to the next point, your actions. Again, I will use very relatable, simple to understand example to help the students to understand better. For example, I will say things like, if you believe that punctuality is very important, what about your action? Whenever you meet your friends, do you leave the house earlier because you worry the bus will come late? Or will you try to reach the meeting point 10 to 15 minutes earlier before the meeting time because you don't want your friend to wait for you? Something like this. Then after this, I will continue the same process over and over again throughout the whole presentation. I will start by giving them a very simple to understand title to trigger their thoughts, reflections, and hopefully make them curious. Then I will explain to them using very simple to understand, relatable example to help them to understand better. And I realized that every time I design my slides in this way, I will see the students a lot more engaged. That is why I feel that whenever we design our slides, less is always more.